Hey guys, it's Horatio. Today I'm going to be showing you a tutorial on how to do blood, um, at least the way that I do it. It's going to be going kind of fast because a lot of it is just like trial and error stuff, but I'll try to make points as the video goes along. So what you can see already is that I've kind of messily laid down the areas where I generally want the blood to be, with a dark red color. I'm using the dark red on a multiply layer above everything else in the image. And to draw the blood, I'm using just a hard round brush with no pressure settings or anything. It's just one size and it stays flat. And I do that because it'll allow me to achieve some harder edges, which I think is important for areas where you want the blood to look, you know, thicker and like it's, I don't know, like it's drippy or whatever. Then I have my eraser set to, it has no size sensitivity or anything, but it does have what is it called? Transparency? Something like that. Yeah, it's got that. So that I can make some smoother transitions, some softer transitions, and it'll let me get kind of a smearing effect for areas where I want the blood to look more like it's smeared rather than it just pooling in one area. Yeah, I basically just kind of put the blood down and then whittle it away with the eraser, put blood back, draw droplets and strings and everything like that. Keep in mind stuff like gravity when you're doing like strings of blood or whatever, so especially if it's like, you know, blood can be kind of heavy, so the further down the string, the thinner it's going to be pulled until it starts like pulling wherever it ends up, wherever it connects, or otherwise, you know, you can have it end in like a little droplet. You can also add little spots of blood, like spray. I've got a bunch of different types of iterations of blood in here so that you can kind of see how I do it. For the spray, I'll do just sort of like a swipe of blood, keeping in mind the planes of the face, so how it's gonna actually, how its trajectory is going to be affected by, you know, the angles of the facial features and stuff like that. And then I'll erase away a bunch until I have a little bit of a tail, and then I'll keep a rounded end.
Barbra Streisand.
Try to keep my shapes kind of oblong and weird so that it doesn't look too, you know, painted on there. Like trying to keep it from being just a bunch of circles. Obviously the droplets and stuff are going to be circles, but for everything else I try to give it a little bit more of a drippy, organic kind of shape.
sauce.
As you can see, there's a lot of just futzing around, trying to figure out what looks best. That's another thing about it too, is that when you're putting blood down, you know, you want to keep in mind, like, oh, how would it work in real life, but also consider your composition or features of the drawing that you don't want to obscure with the blood. You kind of want to treat it as its own part of the composition, like you would any other area of color or shadow or whatever that you have. Like, here I'm moving this spray around to see if there's an area that I think will fit better. Rotating it so that it matches the planes of the face more accurately. And the reason that I do this first layer on, like as a multiply layer, is so I can still see what's underneath it. There are gonna be areas that will look thicker, you know, as I continue rendering, but I like to still consider the blood to be, you know, a liquid, and as it's, you know, spread across stuff, you can see through it. This also just makes it, you know, more interesting to look at when it's not all just a bunch of flat shapes laid across the area. When you do stuff like this, you also are considering, you know, the different textures of the stuff that the blood is on. So you'll see when I erase away a lot of the blood on the glove that I'm keeping it softer, kind of hatching almost, and I'm doing that because the gloves are a fabric, and I want it to look like the blood's kind of soaked into them, rather than just like sitting on top in a big goopy mess. There are some areas that later on will look a little bit more goopy once I add some highlights, but for the most part on the gloves I wanted to keep them looking stained rather than, you know, just dripping. Here I'm adding a couple little areas of drip. Another thing to keep in mind is trying not to make things too like symmetrical or too even. So unless it's important for, say, all the fingers to have the same amount of blood on them, because maybe she dunked her hand in a vat of blood with her fingers all going the same distance. If that's not the case, then, you know, let it be kind of asymmetrical. It'll add more interest, and will just appear a little bit more believable. And obviously you're kind of balancing believability with a little bit of exaggeration. I do a lot of gore art, so usually it's like buckets of blood, and you know, what's the source of the blood? I don't know. Anything. Doesn't really matter. But having the physics of the blood and the distribution and stuff be a little bit more realistic kind of helps to suspend disbelief, I guess. So here I'm going to be moving on to shadows. So I use a red that's a little bit darker than the one I started with. I'm still working on that multiply layer. I've set it to I've locked the layer so that I'm not painting outside of what I already put down, and just laying down some shadows. Try not to overdo it too much, because there's already shadows that are going to be, you know, from the illustration below the blood layer, that will be affecting it. So these ones are more to identify areas where the blood is thicker, and just give it some volume. But you're not slapping shadows everywhere you see them. So like, I'm not gonna have the blood that's coming out of the nose be completely dark, because it's already being affected by that shadow color. I just made it a little bit darker in some areas. And this darker color is important too, because when you start putting in the highlights, a lot of the highlights will be going next to this darker red, so they'll stand out a lot more. They'll look a lot brighter, more vibrant, next to the shadow color. So now I'm moving on to highlights. I've made a new layer over top of the multiply one. So this one is just a normal layer, so that everything on top of this can be opaque if I need it to be. That way it'll be as bright as I want it. So kind of along the same lines as the shadows, you don't want to put too many highlights. Now I use 3 colors for highlights. So with this first one, the distribution will be more than the others. But I still don't want to go, you know, too heavy-handed with it, because it is, you know, a super bright red, and I still want to keep a lot of that darker red that I started with, so that the blood doesn't look too cartoony. I keep more hard edges than soft edges when I've got highlights, but for some of the areas with these bigger highlights, I'll soften them up to spread them out a little bit. And I try to keep a little bit of the darker red between the edge of the area of the blood and the highlight to maintain the volume. And usually the areas that are going to have the most highlight are, you know, the blobbier ones, the ones that are actually going to be, you know, picking up light from the light source. I don't put any on the, like, stained fabric-y areas, except for where there's a little bit of gloop. So now I'm going back to that multiply layer, and I'm using that same bright red color, and I'm going around and using that on just the areas where the blood is thinner. This could be me talking out of my ass, but based on observation from, like, you know, bleeding every so often, it seems like when the blood is thinner, it's, you know, it's brighter, it's more vibrant, like, it hasn't just been sitting there forever. So this just kind of helps with that effect, and also keeps it so that the area that the blood is taking up doesn't feel like as much, if that makes sense. Makes it so that there's not just this, like, giant dark spot on the face, because now, you know, there are areas that are significantly lighter. I am adding a little bit of that even to the stained parts, just for a little bit of variety. Not sure how I feel about that. By the end, but erasing out a little bit extra to get little better trails of smears and stuff. So now we're moving on to the second to last highlights. So these ones are specular, and basically that means that these are the areas that are, like, really reflecting the most light. They are small, a lot of just, like, dots and oval shapes, pretty much, with a little bit of space between them to break up the shapes. Use them sparingly. But as you can see, a lot of them are kind of near areas with that super dark red that I used for the shadows earlier. And it helps them pop out a lot more. Now I'm just hitting a couple of them with white. For that final extra shiny, goopy, bloody touch. And putting my background back in, and there we go. There it is. So that's about it. I hope that this was helpful and informative, or at least interesting to watch, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!